Now, today is Thanksgiving in the United States, which was, Donald Trump told us originally, the deadline for the proposed Ukraine peace plan to be thrashed out between America and Ukraine. Well, now, Vladimir Putin, he's confirmed today that Steve Witkoff is Trump's envoy, is going to be heading to Moscow next week and says the US plan is the basis for future agreements. But what does that really mean? Well, Fabrice Pothier is a former Nato director of policy planning and has been watching this story unfurl. Hello to you, Fabrice.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you for joining us. Fabrice, President Trump, he demanded Ukrainian agreement on a peace plan, with America by Thanksgiving. That, of course, is today. And President Zelensky of Ukraine has worked with America to draft a set of proposals. But what do we see? We see the Kremlin holding firm to its original absolutist demands. So they want more territory, no to NATO for Ukraine, and a smaller Ukrainian army. We're just still at square one, aren't we? And that is not at all surprising.
Well, exactly, because I think we've been there. I have not fully counted, but probably twice or three times we have had a fairly similar diplomatic sequence where Trump started really hard, including against Ukraine, putting extreme pressure, and then the Europeans scrambled for finding some better formula that are in Ukraine and Europe's favor, or at least that protect some of our critical interests. And then you have the Russians who are just standing on the sideline and standing on their uncompromising principles. So I think we've been there. And again, I think what will change this equation is the day President Trump decides to put some real pressure on the culprit,
yes,
on Russia. And until this happens, I think we're going to see more of these episodes.
This is such a familiar conversation, isn't it? I mean, do you feel any optimism at all that President Trump, facing this brick wall by Putin and the Kremlin, any optimism that he will turn the screw harder on Russia?
Frankly, my optimism is more in the Europeans finally getting their act together, because what we're seeing is European leaders and diplomats being very able to save the day, but not to shape the outcome of this war into a peace that is favorable to, or at least favorable enough to Ukraine and to us Europeans, and including UK into that. So I think the key here is not to wait for Godot, not to wait for Trump to somehow be a reasonable, power in strengths and diplomacy through strengths leader, but to expect and try to get the Europeans to actually play the power,
yes,
the hard power diplomacy, put some real flesh on their statements and put some real boots on the ground,
right,
which shows that Europe is willing to own this.
Right, boots on the ground. It comes down to that really, really tough question yet again.
Yes.
I mean, the leaders of the coalition of the willing, as it's called, they've been meeting again this week, and they're talking about how to guard a ceasefire when and if there's a ceasefire in Ukraine yet again. But we've heard today from the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, who says the presence of these coalition troops in Ukraine is, and I'm quoting, absolutely out of the question. So if Vladimir Putin won't agree to that, even if there's a ceasefire, how on earth should the coalition of the willing leaders respond, Fabrice? And what is the point of the coalition if Putin has a veto?
Well, I think exactly. I think it's important not to be fully aware of what Putin is trying to do, which is a typical KGB tactic of writing red lines in our own heads, injecting fear, and therefore deterring ourselves into making the necessary type of decision. So that's one thing. Of course, we cannot underestimate Putin and his willingness to go for military attacks and aggression. But on the other hand, we should also be more confident about the means we have to actually control escalation, because escalation should not just be one-sided. It should be a way for us to also, through the means we have, to actually put a cost on Putin's action where he will think twice before he takes other kind of actions. So, and finally, I think it's important to compare the different scenarios. We have the current scenario where failure is not completely implausible, and Ukraine failing will be putting Europe, including the UK, in great danger.
Yes.
And of course, putting boots on the ground also brings its own risk. But I think there's no good scenario. And the question is, what are we willing to underwrite in terms of risks to be able to have a more secure and stable Europe?
What briefly, do you mean when you talk about boots on the ground in this conversation? Because it's difficult to imagine those coalition leaders agreeing to send troops into Ukraine. Still less, boots on the ground, on Ukrainian territory while the fighting is going on.
Well, I think it's important, John, not to be too generic when you talk about boots on the ground. I'm talking here about mostly support to the Ukrainian forces. So the fighting will still belong to the Ukrainian forces. But there's a great deal we can do also because of the capabilities we have to actually help the Ukrainians better defend their cities, their population, and some of their forces. So you are releasing some of the pressure because now they have to do both the offensive and the defensive. So if we were more in the rear, to be able to actually help defend their population so that, for example, Putin's air terror campaign will be much less successful than what we have seen in the last few months. That will already be a success. And it won't necessarily put us in direct confrontation with Russian forces. So I think there are whole grades of things we can do, including in the maritime domain, where the UK has played a very important role. But I think it could be extended to make sure that the gains of the past few years in the Black Sea are maintained and that the Russians cannot come back with a vengeance. The same in the air domain. Fighter jets are obviously less politically sensitive than pure boots on the ground, soldiers on the front line. And European NATO fighter jets could help to shoot down some of the 500 plus projectiles that the Russians are throwing at Ukrainian cities every day.
Interesting thoughts. Fabrice Pothier, Director of Policy formerly at NATO. Thank you. Now,
thank you very much, John.
And a big good afternoon to Doug Klein, the fellow at the Atlantic Council. Hello to you, Doug.
Hey, good morning, John.
Hi. So, listening there to Fabrice's thoughts, I wonder what yours are. I mean, if the ball is back in President Trump's court, as well as in that of European leaders, do you imagine President Trump will now make another move to really put the squeeze on Putin?
Well, I'm in violent agreement with everything that Fabrice just said. When we look at President Trump's strategy here, I think that a really important thing to keep in mind was that the timing for this latest push on peace efforts mattered quite a lot. And so he did that just as there was a domestic scandal going on in Ukraine over corruption. Both the Kremlin and the White House perceived Zelensky as being particularly politically weak, and that this might be an opportune time to force through some kind of a peace deal and force Ukraine to agree to something. There was a bit of a miscalculation on the White House's part on this, though. Ukrainian society really rallied around the government to try to present a united front to this pressure. The Ukrainians' objective here was to come in and make sure that they are seen as not the obstacle to peace, to say yes to what Trump was asking for in some way, to renegotiate a deal and try to get the pressure back on Moscow and make sure that the Russians are seen as the obstacle to peace, not Ukraine.
Right. It was only this time last week that President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, drew up, together with Russia, a set of proposals. They were clearly so pro-Russian. Do you think Steve Witkoff, frankly, is performing a particularly useful role now? He is so widely seen as unqualified. President Trump referred to him in that way publicly a little while ago. The president said he knows nothing about diplomacy or Russia. Is he performing a useful role, do you think?
Well, Republicans in Washington don't think so. In fact, after this latest report of Witkoff coaching the Kremlin on how to get what they want with Trump, there's many Republican members of Congress that are showing backlash against this. Several are calling for Witkoff to be removed. And some are saying that Secretary of State Marco Rubio needs to be allowed to do his job. Many of them see Rubio as really the adult in the room. After Witkoff seemed to have been freelancing here almost, trying to get some kind of an agreement himself with the Russians and then present that as almost a fait accompli, Rubio came into these talks in Geneva with the Ukrainians to iron out a deal that Ukraine actually could agree to,
Yes.
though they have notably left the thorniest issues of things like security guarantees, territory, and of course those hundreds of billions in frozen Russian assets up to a decision between Trump, Zelensky at a later date.
Yeah, and yet President Trump stays loyal to Steve Witkoff, his old friend, his old business partner, and Witkoff is the one going to Moscow next week.
Indeed, indeed. President Trump actually, when he was asked about these tapes of Witkoff coaching the Russians, he waved it away. He said, this is kind of a normal thing to do. We're in negotiations, and he said that Steve has to get the Russians on board with Ukraine, and that it's a very normal thing to coach them. But I would say it's really not a normal thing. That call that came in October between Putin and Trump that Witkoff had coached the Russians on how to handle that. It came as Trump was considering sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, something the Russians really wanted to avoid. And Witkoff's coaching seemed to have paid off. Trump abandoned his plans to send those missiles to Ukraine and has since put the screws back on Kyiv.
All right, Doug Klain at the Atlantic Council, good to talk to you.